Welcome to the Thin Places Travel Podcast, where we discuss places where the veil between this world and the eternal world is thin. I'm your host, Mindie Burgoyne.
I often say to people that, when you're sitting in an Irish pub, surrounded by Irish people and the music playing, the pipes and the bodhrán and the whistles playing and a lot of locals singing along, your Irish DNA will be fully reignited. And the first symptom is your boot starts moving.
Right.
It starts there, and before you know it, you're singing along yourself.
Coming up, we'll hear from Barry Moloney, part of the Don and Barry duo that operate Kinsale Historic Strolls. And I'll share some information about the oldest ghost tour in Ireland, as well as a beautiful place near Kinsale that was founded by a saint that many believe preceded St. Patrick in bringing Christianity to Ireland. Well, I'm back. We've had quite a lag in time since the last episode. And since then, I have been on a tour to thin places in Scotland. And I've also taken a 10-day tour to Newfoundland and Labrador and been working with my day job. So I apologize for the lag, but we're back in sync now and hopefully we'll be on a regular schedule with the podcasts. Today, we're going to talk about a place that isn't necessarily a thin place. We're going to talk about Kinsale in County Cork. It's off the coast of Southern Ireland. And it isn't a thin place, but sometimes you just need to relax and rejuvenate and have fun. And most lovers of thin places and these liminal spaces also love history and stories of the local people, their heroes and their villains. And Kinsale is so rich in history and so beautiful a town that it's a great place to relax, and it is surrounded by many thin places. So I thought it would be worthwhile to talk about a place that you can go to rest up while you're traveling in sacred spots. I always enjoy going to Kinsale. I'll let our guest tell you about the features, the historic features, and more about the town. But I want to just preface it by saying it's a great home base. It's a foodie town. It's an artsy town. It's a town that just vibrates with creative energy. So let's get on to our interview with Barry Moloney and talk a little bit more about Kinsale. Very happy to have Barry Moloney from Don and Barry's Kinsale Historic Strolls. Did I say it right?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
Anyway, we just had our tour group go through a full tour with Barry, and they were delighted. So I asked Barry to join us today to talk to us a little bit about Kinsale and what a visitor might be able to encounter coming to this lovely little town in County Cork. So welcome, Barry.
Thanks, Mindy. It's a pleasure to meet you here, and thanks for asking me to talk.
Well, I'm glad to have you. Tell me, if you were to talk to somebody who's never been to Kinsale, and they were coming here maybe for a day, a free day, what would you encourage them to see besides, obviously, your tour, which is very highly rated?
Well, I'd say the top reasons people come to Kinsale would be the scenery, the harbour. First of all, it's a perfect sheltered harbour, horseshoe-shaped harbour, eventually with panoramic views of the Atlantic Ocean. So people like to experience that either walking along the piers or doing longer hikes along the coastline, visiting a fort. There's a 17th century fort called Charles Fort, built by the English here, which has panoramic views of the harbour. So people love that. People also visit for the food. We have 55 eating houses.
Wow.
For such a small town, population of 3,500 people.
So obviously the local people are not keeping everybody in business. You've got a lot of visitors.
A lot of visitors.
I'm sure your locals. How about people coming in from other parts of Ireland? Do they come in?
Oh, sure, yeah. We're very close to Cork City, half an hour drive from Cork City, and there's a population up there of 120,000.
Oh, okay.
So Kinsale is a foodie town. Also, people come for the history, to visit some of the historic sites, Desmond Castle, a medieval church, St. Malta's Church, and to go to the pubs. A lot of visitors would have roots in Ireland, perhaps Irish Americans or Irish Canadians. A lot of English visitors who their families would have been coming to Kinsale for generations.
Right. I noticed on your tour, it obviously is focused on history and very interesting history. What gets you the oohs and the ahs in your tour where you're talking about various points in history? Because you really do cover it quite well.
The moments in history, what surprises and connects people here is, I would say, the Battle of Kinsale, which was triggered by a Spanish Armada fleet taking control of the walled town and the harbour in 1601. That's quite a surprise for some people. This, a lot of people from abroad are well aware of the impact of the Spanish Empire through the 15 and 1600s and didn't expect an Irish connection there. Also, people connect with more recent history, the sinking of the Lusitania, just off our coastline here, and a lot more in between. Kinsale has a harbour which was very busy in the 16 and 1700s. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of connections with names like Sir William Penn, John and Charles Wesley, Daniel Defoe, various connections that people make. So for a lot of people, a visit to Kinsale joins the dots with what they have heard about Ireland.
Right.
For a lot of people, it's their first stop outside of Dublin. So they leave the big city, finally they're here in what visitors would consider a village, right on the coastline. It's what they feel Ireland is, with the green scenery around it and all the colourful buildings. It's a paradise for a photographer. And as you know, with the modern technology, we're all travel photographers.
Yeah, we are all travel photographers. It is very scenic. Let me ask you this. How long have you lived in Kinsale?
All my life, really. I grew up on a farm just up the river from here, 3 miles up the river. Went to school in the convent overlooking the town.
You did?
And, left school 30 years ago this year.
So do you think that the place you're in has a connection to you? Like, could you do what you do anywhere? Or is there a certain, I'm always looking at a sense of place. If you think Kinsale obviously has a sense of
Good
place
question.
because, but usually you can say, have they wrote a poem about it? Have they written a song about it? Or does it move people to, is there some kind of magnetic draw that draws people back? Everybody has a special affinity with their own hometown, but Kinsale must have something special because a lot of people come here. It can't just be that you've done such a great job with tourism. It has to be more than that. So what do you think about that? What are your thoughts?
Good question. I have tour guided all across Ireland, north and south, and even across Europe as an assistant guide on various tours. And here, what makes here different for me is it's my home. So that means as a guide, while I'm talking, I meet people and try to make every tour different than the last. So I interact with the people passing us on the street.
Right.
The town undertaker might pass. A famous poet living here might pass. That might not want attention drawn to him. So maybe I'll mention that after he's passed by. And it means also I can tell stories related to life here. Growing up in a farm, what did it mean to be one of 7 in a farm just up the river, going to school in the Convent of Mercy, and how life has changed in Ireland during my lifetime and how that relates to Kinsale. Also, Kinsale has a history which makes, for Ireland anyway, quite a multicultural town in the sense that we've a Methodist church, Anglican church, 2 Catholic churches, and a variety of settlers throughout the centuries have come here. Obviously, mostly from England and Wales, but also in more recent times, that means we're very open-minded to people who have holiday homes here and coming and settling in. So it's a very interesting town. I suppose you could say there's 2 Kinsales. In the winter, everybody knows everybody. Then in the summer, you have this buzz of people coming and going with holiday homes.
Because it's a resort town. When did Kinsale get its renaissance? It really did sort of get propelled forward for the tourist. When did that happen? What was the thing that turned the tide there?
I say what turned the tide was food. Because in the 1970s, a few skilled chefs decided to set up restaurants here with access to good fresh seafood and good meat as well from inland and dairy produce. The early restaurants would have been Man Friday, named after a famous voyage. The inspiration for the Robinson Crusoe novel, the real-life voyage, began here. Also Jim Edwards. They'd be 2, and the Blue Haven. They'd be the 3 main restaurants that gave Kinsale a foodie vibe for people in Cork City. Then what happened then actually to really generate Kinsale was, believe it or not, a recession in the 1980s. With a very bad recession in Ireland. And a lot of Irish chefs left, went to work in San Francisco and abroad, London, wherever. And when things picked up, then they came back. And many of them opened restaurants here in Kinsale with new and vibrant influences, such as Fishy Fishy. The chef in Fishy Fishy once worked in the Huntington Hotel in San Francisco and admired the foodie scene there. So he brought the inspiration of Asian restaurants in San Francisco back to the Irish fish restaurant here, where meanwhile in Ireland in the 1980s, we cooked the hell out of fish and drowned it in sauce. So it was seen as a penance to eat fish here.
Right.
Whereas he brought this new, fresh, kind of simple style of presentation to Kinsale, and then got his own TV show and cookbooks and all this, more and more awareness to the town for Irish people. Then for people coming from abroad who wouldn't be connected here through a kind of a tradition of visiting Kinsale, we say, we're lucky in our location in that a lot of travellers obviously fly into Ireland to Dublin or Shannon. A normal route, the most interesting history and scenery is along the coastline. So a normal route would be, say, Kinsale, Kinmare, Killarney, Dingle, Galway.
Right.
This would be the sort of the distance apart, because of the Irish roads being so narrow, between Kinsale and Kinmare or Dingle is ideal for a 1 or 2 night stay here for people who are driving on their own, or also for 2 groups. So it's there's a lot of factors that influence the success of Kinsale. Whereas, say, other villages, which could be a little bit more remote along the coastline, would tend not to have that steady stream of people passing through.
So it's famous for food. Yeah, it's interesting that the shopping is very good too. So the shopping, the historical stuff, the crafters. We happened to be here on a Wednesday when the market was here. Has that done a lot for Kinsale? Do people come out for that Wednesday?
Yes, yeah. There's a farmer's market and a craft market in the town every Wednesday morning. Even through the winter, that runs. So that's for the locals as well. And yeah, there's a certain style to the shops. You know, a lot of people do like do some activities in the morning, have a light lunch, and then split off and free time, shopping time, and meet again and buy souvenirs for friends back home. And, you know, Kinsale has a lot of interesting shops. There's one shop here makes handbags from sailcloth.
Do they? Sailcloth?
Sailcloth from a yacht that sailed all the way around the world. So you can buy a little purse or handbag, and inside it, on the sailcloth that it's made from, you see the route of the famous yacht that sailed around the world.
Isn't that funny? And what's that called? What is that shop called? Do you remember?
I think it's called Mamoko.
We can look it up.
We can look that up.
That's great. Yeah, and you have a very interesting ferry store here. So for the people that listen to us, that's I went in and chatted with the owner of that, and she has a lot of metaphysical stuff, and but a lot of your shops are really key into that crystal energy, and that's not common all around Ireland, I found. So
yes, there is. I suppose you could say in the 70s, a lot of, we could generalize and say hippie-ish people,
right,
escaping the fast pace of life in Europe. Dutch and German people settled in West Cork, just west of here. And a lot of them started up craft industries like cheese making and textiles. And that has developed a certain sort of feeling to Kinsale. We're kind of not far from the city, close to the harbour, but then just west of us is West Cork, where it's very farming, rural. But also we have these eclectic people, artists passing through, musicians. Tori Amos has a house here.
What other famous people live in Kinsale? Or people that some people might know? Yeah,
artists to us. I mean, it's known for writers. At one stage, 3 members of Ireland's Éisteanna lived here. Éisteanna is this sort of bardic tradition where the government support artists. And they, sadly, 2 of them have passed away now, but they were Desmond O'Grady, a poet, Derek Mahan, he's still alive, a wonderful poet as well, and Aidan Higgins, very interesting writer in the style of Joyce and Beckett. His stories have no start, middle, or end to them. It's all about playing with the language. He wrote Language Go Down, which became a movie starring Jeremy Irons. He lives just west of here as well, Jeremy Irons, in a castle.
Oh, that's right. Jeremy Irons does live here. I remember that. West Cork, I guess he lives.
Yeah. Artists, painters, a lot of galleries around here.
Yeah, so we noticed that when there's a certain energy of a place, they do tend to attract artists. That's
And one example of that kind of curiosity, in Kinsale we have 5 bookshops, which is very unusual. You would believe that one bookshop would put the other out of business.
Right.
But it's the opposite, in fact, that if you want to browse bookstores, look for secondhand books, for example, a lot of people like to do so. They'll go for a day in Kinsale, have a tea in the Poets Corner, which is a book swap cafe, and then head to some secondhand stores and check out some new books as well. And it's an exciting place to just read a few chapters and watch the world go by.
Do they have seafood boats that ever come in here, or do they come in mostly at Castletown Bear? Do you have a fishing industry here?
Oh, we do. Yeah, we do have a fishing industry. The fishing fleet employ over 80 here locally. They're mostly out now. It's a calm day, but they dock down in a place called World's End. And mentioning Fishy, the restaurant, that's part of their success. The chef there, he buys directly from the boats here. So there's no middleman, there's no wholesaler in between. So he keeps it as quick as possible between swimming around in the sea and on the plate.
And how many pubs do you have here?
25.
25
pubs. And so obviously, if you divide 3,500 people by 25 pubs, it may not look an economic prospect. But what happens is we have festivals in the summer, which really boost the pub revenue. For example, in May, it wouldn't be for everybody now, but in May we have a rugby festival here where 700 rugby players and 3,000 supporters take over Kinsale for a weekend. Wow. And in that weekend alone, the pubs make enough money to survive for most of the rest of the year because they like to party, those rugby players.
When is that? Do we miss it?
That's in May. They say, if you don't like the scrum, then scram, because it's not for everybody.
What other kind of festivals?
We also have an arts festival where the shops in the streets become walking galleries. You walk by and see the painting in the windows. We have a literary festival. We have 2 food festivals, which kind of bookend the season. One is in April. We have a chowder cook-off. Mm-hmm. Just in front of where we're sitting now, there's a lawn. And a huge marquee will be set up there. And 32 chefs, one from each county of Ireland, north and south, come to Kinsale, cook their best chowder. And we, the people, select which tastes the best. So we select the best seafood chowder in Ireland. And that chef then, this year from the Beara Peninsula in County Cork, will go to Newport, Rhode Island, which is our twin city, across the Atlantic to represent Ireland in an international chowder cook-off. That's the Chowder Festival. And around that, we have all the stores and restaurants and cafes have food stalls. So you have a walking meal through the town. Then we have a food festival at the end of the season as well, which is more a bigger affair. You kind of have to pre-book all your tickets and more tastings. And
what do they do with the literary festival? What do they do?
Well, the literary festival actually this season now is the first time it's been rejuvenated. Okay. It stopped for a while. A lot of poets live nearby, so there'll be poetry readings. My walking tour will be a literary focused tour that morning, where I'll obviously focus on the history still, but read some poems which will relate to events that happened here, or some passages from writers. For example, Aidan Higgins, I mentioned earlier, he's a wonderful passage about Kinsale. The streets are medieval here and maze-like. So there's no block system at all. It's all higgledy-piggledy. Mm-hmm. And he says Kinsale is a wonderful town because when you walk out of town and turn around and come back in, it's like you're entering an entirely different town. So it's a wonderful town to walk through. There's all different angles. And
it's a great walking town.
It is, yeah. And mostly flat and compact as well, quite close by.
If there was an American who had never been to Kinsale and they were coming to Ireland, and they were to say, why should I come to Kinsale?
Well, this might sound like just a practicality now, but a lot of Americans who come to Ireland, one of the most difficult things they find is driving.
Right.
Number of reasons, wrong side of the road, very, very narrow roads, and Irish people, like Italians, driving around like crazy around them, So Kinsale is an ideal place. You can have a car-free day. You can just arrive here, check into your bed and breakfast or hotel. Then for the entire day, walk, stroll, even walk out to the fort. It's 1.5 miles, but take you 45, 50 minutes. Get a taxi back, go on a harbour cruise. If you've a little mini group of people, you could hire a yacht for a half day and a skipper will take you out to the outer harbour, out by the old head of Kinsale, or even fishing trips are available as well. I would say, put it this way, the human scale. We don't have big shopping malls. We have these small butchers, these bakeries, cafes. So you can really feel it's not quite the scale of now. I had an amazing experience myself when I was in Venice, and you walk in Venice in the evening and you feel like you're suddenly in medieval times. Mm-hmm. It's not quite to that scale, obviously. It's a much, much smaller town. But people get that feeling of sort of comfort and away from technology and modernity. And that's how the history tour I do connects people as well, because if some people just walk by on their own, they don't know the stories of what's going on beneath the streets or behind the doors of the castles and the churches, and why Kinsale is so vibrant today. Why does it have this wonderful mix of people and, as I said, a medieval streetscape where people get lost. First thing they do when they come here, a map is fairly useless, It's like, Have you been to Venice? It's like
I haven't, no.
Getting lost in Venice is one of the things you'll do again and again. It's a wonderful place to get lost because a map is useless, completely useless due to the angles of the streets.
Right. Driving is definitely a challenge for Americans. even when they start to drive, they get nervous and it's stressful. And so
Sure,
to come
yeah.
to a car-free town,
And
that's great insight.
when I lead my tours in the morning, I see a lot of mirrors that get knocked off because the streets are so narrow here. People can barely get through, you know, in terms of driving. But luckily, we've car parks and hotel parking, and
Right.
so people really breathe a sigh of relief. Then, you know, they can relax here before setting off for maybe Dingle or Kenmare or Killarney the next day and exploring more. That's a practicality, you know. And people like to slow down here. I mentioned West Cork, which is the region. We're on the border with West Cork, really. And they say West Cork is not so much a place, it's a state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
People have time for each other. Irish people in the towns, like Kinsale, we love to talk. And visitors like to connect in that way, especially if they got roots in Ireland. They like to hear a funny story or, you know, connect. I've often had funny stories like just last week on one of my tours, a lady she was from Saskatchewan in Canada. She was here tracing her roots, but unluckily for her, her roots were from the McCarthy family, which is the most popular surname in this area. But nonetheless, she asked in some of the local, she didn't have much detail, but she was asking around and she went into this little shop, this little old lady behind the counter, and she said, Eileen McCarthy, my ancestor, left this area in 1852. And the lady behind the counter said, should the place is full of McCarthy's? She said, hang on a second. And she went down under the counter, brought up this dusty old ledger, and she brushed it off and she was looking through. And then she said, wait a minute. She said, actually, Eileen McCarthy, I have her name here and date. She did leave here. And guess what? She left behind an unpaid debt in the shop. And she said, an ancestor at some stage would settle that debt. So would you like to pay it or would you like to leave it for the next generation? Of course, she was completely joking, but, you know, it's just these stories
That's so funny.
These stories that make it for people. And in Kinsale as well, we've good music in the nighttime that just connects people even apart from their language. Mm-hmm. I often say to people that, you know, when you're sitting in an Irish pub surrounded by Irish people and the music playing, you know, the pipes and the bodhrán and the whistles playing and a lot of locals singing along, your Irish DNA will be fully reignited. And the first symptom is your boot starts moving.
Right.
It starts there, you know, and before you know it, you're singing along yourself. And that experience is really powerful for people who, especially Irish Americans, Irish Canadians, who this might be their first visit here.
Right.
It's very powerful feeling.
They want to connect. They definitely want to
connect. The roots are deep here.
So if you had 3 spots in Kinsale where you'd say that have the loveliest or most inspiring views, if you had to pick 3 places where you just say, I love standing here looking at this view, what would they be?
Sure. One would be just behind the Spaniard Bar. It's halfway up to the fort. So it's about 15 minutes walk out of the town. And you're up high. So from there you can see Charles Fort and James Fort. They were 2 star-shaped forts built in the 1600s. Just like you had Charlestown and Jamestown. You had Charles Fort and James Fort here. And you can see the forts. They're guarding the entrance to the harbour. And beyond the forts, you can see the old head of Kinsale and the Atlantic Ocean. And from the same view, you can see all the way up the Bandon River and back in towards Kinsale. So it's a 180-degree panorama.
Wow.
And really, a camera can't take it in unless you got that panoramic zoom some people have. That's a wonderful viewpoint. The other, I would say, is there's a little walk over the town, back up behind the town, and it's called Compass Hill, the Compass Hill Walk. It's called that because on that little walk, you'll see north, south, east, and west. It's a little circular road around a hill overlooking Kinsale. And because it's circular, nobody really drives there other than people that live along it in these wonderful Georgian mansions that you'll pass. So it's practically pedestrianised. And there you'll get a variety of views, harbour, river, and countryside views. And the other viewpoint really strikes me is a little bit out of town, 10 minutes drive out of town, overlooking the old head of Kinsale, which is where there's a famous golf course. You'd park up at the entrance to the golf course, walk right, and there you get quite a surprise. Cliff views to rival the Cliffs of Moher, like a little miniature Cliffs of Moher right there, with no barrier. So there's nothing between you and the drop. You know, you have to be very careful there if the wind is the wrong way. But it's a spectacular view. And that's where the Lusitania was torpedoed. That's where a lighthouse has existed for almost 2,000 years on the point. There's really a lot of history there and beautiful beaches nearby that you can walk on. It's the beginning. That's the first viewpoint on the Irish tourist route called the Wild Atlantic Way, which is a genius of an invention by our tourist board.
Mm-hmm.
They marked a road that already existed and called it the Wild Atlantic Way. It hugs the shoreline all the way from Kinsale to Donegal, almost 2,000 miles later. It's a coast, like Highway 1, basically,
Right.
but
Yeah,
right
you've
out.
been on it.
Right
Even
out.
goes out onto the islands. I noticed they had a Wild
Yes.
Atlantic Way on Inisheer.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, they have to ride across the water. This is obviously not a contiguous highway.
Yeah, it's like Tiernan Og, the
Right,
story of the
right,
horse
right.
riding across the water. Miracles are possible.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, just I'd like to invite your listeners, come to visit Kinsale, come to visit Ireland. And it's a wonderful first, Ireland generally, and also Kinsale, wonderful first destination for people who want to visit Europe, because we speak a common language, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good stepping stone. And also Ireland is very relaxed. If a lot of people want to escape the big city, New York, the fast-paced lifestyle, that's why they really appreciate not the big cities, Cork, Dublin, Limerick, but small towns, villages along the coastline, and just slow down and see where Ireland takes you.
Barry, how can they find you? How can people that come find your tours?
People who are interested in our tour can find us on our website. Maybe link that on the podcast.
Okay.
And also at the tourist office. That's our starting point. Or they can just Google our name. It's a bit of a mouthful, the name of our tour, Don and Barry's tour. But we said we'd follow the example of Heineken and Guinness and Murphy's. Name your tour after yourselves, because then you've got a brand that you can sort of build. And so Don and Barry, think of Ben and Jerry. We're like the Ben and Jerry of Kinsale history. Don and Barry's tour.
Great. Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Mindie. Pleasure to meet you.
Kinsale has the oldest ghost tour in Ireland. That's something we don't typically talk about on the Thin Places podcast, but I think it's worth a brief mention, because part of the fun about being in Kinsale is going on this old ghost tour. And as somebody that has written probably 15 or 16 ghost tours for people to attend, I am impressed with what these guys have done in Kinsale. I've been on a few ghost tours in Ireland. They have one on the bus in Dublin, and they have one in Belfast. But I can tell you that people have different preconceived notions about ghost tours. The expectations are not consistent. Everybody sees a ghost tour as something different. To some, it might be a historic walking tour. To others, it might be more on the caliber of a paranormal investigation, where you're going to go inside buildings and conjure up spirits. So this ghost tour is similar to the ones that you see like in Williamsburg, where they're theatrical interpretations of the stories. So they're very entertaining. It's more like going to a theatrical performance. This ghost tour starts in the Tap Tavern, which is the oldest tavern in Kinsale. There's two actors, Brian O'Neill and Don Herlihy, and they dress in character and they lead a group of guests around historic Kinsale, the town center, and they recount stories of ghosts and historical figures. In a way, they keep the guests' attention and keep guests laughing. The performance is very well done, and there are some elements of surprise in it. So at the Tap Tavern, it actually begins in the tavern. It's a very historical tavern. I think it's the oldest tavern in Kinsale. I think it's been in Brian O'Neill's family since the late 1800s, and he and his mother still run it. In fact, I met his mother, a lovely lady, when I went in there to interview Brian. The tour takes about 90 minutes, and it covers all the interesting parts of the town. Very entertaining, and we've got the link to it in the show notes. If you're in Kinsale, do yourself a favor and attend this ghost tour. Today I'm going to talk about a small town in the south of Ireland in County Waterford that is a very thin place, and it's not as well traveled as some of the other sacred sites. It's the town of Ardmore. It's a seaside resort, touristy town. It's also a fishing village. It's near a place called Youghal, and it's not too far from Kinsale or Cork City. There is a sense of thinness about this place as you approach it. And I'm not sure how to describe that. I've tried to describe that when talking about Cashel, but Ardmore has the same kind of effect on me and on guests that I take there. As when you come up that hill to where those ecclesiastical ruins are, You climb up, those ruins come into view. It's almost like a skyline coming into view. You know, you see a skyline and you think, wow, that's New York, or that's Chicago, or that's San Francisco, and it's so recognizable. Well, certainly this little cluster of monastic ruins is not on that large a scale, but it has every bit the impact. When you see the Ardmore round tower, along with that old church with the etchings on the side of it, you know you've come to a place of memory and a place that is sacred. And it was probably sacred long before those ruins were ever built atop that hill. Atop the hill are stunning views of the bay. There's a cliff walk around the town, which goes by a holy well. There's a sacred stone on the beach. I mean, there's everything you want in Ardmore. The town of Ardmore means high place or great height. And the ecclesiastical ruins are on a hill, as I mentioned, cliff walk that goes above the sea. So it is a high place, and it's associated with St. Declan. He was a 5th century saint who established the monastic community there on the hill. And St. Declan is said to have preceded St. Patrick as a bishop and leader of the Christian movement in Ireland, and that he came before Patrick. There are several lives written about St. Declan, which is rare for Irish saints. And he's revered all throughout County Waterford. In Ardmore, there are several devotional stops that are traveled by pilgrims and are associated with St. Declan. And they include the ecclesiastical ruins up on the hill, a holy well, and a large stone on the beach. And according to these lives written about St. Declan, he was born in the region and later went to Rome and became a bishop. And there's a story about when St. Declan left Rome and returned to County Waterford. He came to Ardmore with his plans to build a monastery, but he left Rome without his bell. And a bishop's bell was symbolic, like a crozier. It's a symbol of authority, a symbol of being able to call people to come together. And because Declan was so special and so blessed, God's angel sent his bell afloat on top of a stone that floated across the ocean and landed right in Ardmore to bring St. Declan's bell that he had left behind. So there is a large stone sitting on top of 2 smaller ones down on the beach. And it is said to be that stone. And it is said to have curative powers for those who crawl under it. And by the way, crawling under that stone would be a task. You'd have to be very, very skinny or dig out the smaller stones that are underneath of it. I don't know if people still try to crawl under it, but I wouldn't be doing that. But these old legends were begun in a different time. And they were told to people who had a different perspective. The thinking patterns when these legends were established were very abstract. And the meaning of the story is rooted in the understanding that an object could connect people in this world to the powers and the graces of the eternal world. And maybe that connection might bring healing, or maybe it might bring wisdom. But being close to these sacred monuments elevates our awareness and our spiritual vibration. So I have stood by that stone. The beach there is very, very rocky with small stones, so it's not an easy walk out there. But there is something about standing in the presence of that stone and reflecting on the stories. And the pilgrims who have gone before and stood in the same place and experienced the same devotional energy and power that is around that stone. I remember standing by it and looking down and just at my feet, finding a perfectly shaped little stone in the shape of a heart. It was light colored while all of the other stones were dark. And I remember putting it in my pocket and taking it home with me. And I can grasp that stone, close my eyes while I'm sitting at my desk 3,000 miles away. And it is so much easier in my mind to go back to Ardmore and that same feeling I had when I was standing there. And these are characteristics of thin places, of those liminal spaces that have a certain power or energy that maybe we don't understand, but we know we can experience it. And from the stone on the beach, pilgrims travel up the main road in the town, and that leads to a path, and the path goes up to this gorgeous cliff walk. But on the path is St. Declan's Holy Well, and it is one of the more beautiful holy wells in Ireland. It's very well defined. The water is clean, at least it was last time I was there. It's in a peaceful little spot, and the locals have built a sort of wall or frame around the well in stone. So there's an opening for the well there, and then above the well are 3 stone crosses. They're small, and they were to represent Calvary, Christ, and then on either side, the 2 thieves, one that was the repentant thief and one that was the unrepentant thief. But actually, there's only 2 crosses now. The cross on the left, which was for the unrepentant thief, is missing. And the locals say it was stolen, which is kind of ironic. Others say it might have been just fallen off with time, but it's a lovely little site. And the water from that holy well is said to have curative powers for the eyes or healing pain in the joints. So after you go past the holy well, there's an opportunity to take that path all the way around. It's a big horseshoe path that walks along the side of the cliffs with these magnificent views. So for a walking meditation after you've visited the holy well, that is just such a worthwhile extension of the holy well visit. And then, probably the most profound thing that is at Ardmore are the ecclesiastical ruins. So they're on a hilltop behind the village, and the buildings there date back to the 8th century. So they were placed there on a site that was likely to have been where St. Declan's monastery was. Now, established in the 5th century, those buildings would have been made of wood and they'd be long gone. But you're still in the same sacred spot that this saint decided to use to begin his journey, his spiritual journey, and a saint that had a great impact on the region. So there on that site is a big graveyard. So you have gravestones all around. But you have the oldest building, which is a tiny building. You can almost miss it. It's said to be the oratory, St. Declan's oratory, and they believe that it is built right over top where St. Declan would have been buried. So it's a sacred spot in that it is connected to the great saint's remains and where he rests. The other building that's really amazing is the Round Tower. The Round Tower at Ardmore is about 100 feet high. They think it dates back to the 12th century. It's built in sections, which makes it kind of unique. It's very narrow at the top. The batter is what it's called, how the tower goes from the width at the bottom to the width at the top. It has a marked decrease to the width at the top. I think the cap on the top, which is very well placed, has been shot off and replaced over time. But it just towers above the other ruins. And it is very stunning when you see it. That's the big focal point in the skyline, as it were. There has a very sad story about it. Evidently, there was a British skirmish between the locals and the British soldiers, and the local Irish went and hid, and about 20 of them hid in the tower. The tower has several levels, kind of like a lighthouse would. And eventually, the Irish surrendered to the British, and they came out of the tower, and they were all summarily hanged. And there's a little memorial there to those people. And that was in more recent years. So you do have that little bit of sorrow. And also under the Round Tower, they did a little excavation beneath it and found 2 bodies facing east. So it is likely that this whole thing was built on an ancient cemetery. So the other piece to the ecclesiastical ruins is the church. It's a roofless church. And what makes this church so unique is that it has what's believed to be a 9th century work of art, an etching, put into the gable wall. So the gable wall has this giant carving attached to it. And the carving is of Bible saints. There's Adam and Eve, and there's the wisdom of King Solomon, and I think the gift of the Magi. There's St. Declan's supposed to be up there. And it's kind of like the etchings you see on the high crosses. It's just beautiful. And I will tell, we had an experience at that gable wall on tour. Everyone was looking, standing there looking up at this carving on the side of the wall. It almost spans the entire width of the wall, so it's quite large. And I pointed out the Bible stories, and one of them is the wisdom of Solomon. And somebody said, well, what's that story? And I happened to know it. Catholics, we don't know our Bible stories, but I did know that one. And so I told the story at the wall. It's a simple story. The picture is of 2 women, one, in line behind the other, and then what looks like a swordsman, and then King Solomon sitting in his throne, and someone is handing King Solomon a baby. And the story is that these 2 women came to King Solomon, both claiming to be the mother of this baby. And they asked him to make the judgment of who should get the baby, who is the rightful mother. And so Solomon, in his great wisdom, said, well, I'm going to call my swordsman, and we will cut the baby in half, and we'll give you each half of the baby. Then you'll both be happy. And so they are dumbfounded, naturally, because the baby would be dead. But he calls his swordsman, raised the sword over the baby, and just as the swordsman is about to heave the baby in half, one of the women comes forth and says, no, don't. She's the real mother. And Solomon, in his wisdom, knew that this woman who was speaking had to be the baby's rightful mother, because only a mother's love would be so unselfish that she would sacrifice her own happiness and endure almost an unbearable sorrow to be without her child in order to save the child. So Solomon made his judgment to give that child to the woman who cried out. The reason I recount that here is, as I recounted that story in front of the wall, something happened to all of us. It certainly wasn't my brilliant storytelling. It was when you marry the story, the spoken word, especially if it's a sacred story, to the sacred art, and you put them together at the same time, something happens that is greater than the effects of the two separate parts. It's kind of an experience. It reminded me of when you read a child a story and they become so mesmerized with the pictures and hearing the spoken word. And one of the guests came forward and she said, I'll never forget this. I'll never forget what this looks like. And as you were talking, all I could think of was the artist, and how the artist must have felt as he was carving these figures into this wall. And did he have any idea that 10 centuries later, people like us would be sitting here looking at those etchings and recounting that lesson, reflecting on that Bible story? So I think things like this happen in places of power. And Ardmore is certainly one of those places. One other thing, inside a little niche in that church ruin is an Ogham stone. Ogham stones are tall stones with little slash marks on the sides. And that's the ancient Irish writing. And they're all over Ireland. But the one in Ardmore is especially well preserved. It's really a good example of what these Ogham stones look like. And most of the time, the writing signifies the person who was there. It's almost like graffiti, I was here. It's somebody's name. And I believe that's the case with the stone in Ardmore. But it is, again, it's the ability to touch a stone and connect with the moments that were taken when the artist made the markings, right? So Ardmore, again, not too far from Kinsale, a great thin place to reach out to when you're staying in Kinsale in County Waterford. Thank you for listening to the Thin Places Travel Podcast. You can find us on the web at thinplacespodcast.com. And you can also find me on Twitter at TravelHags and on Facebook at facebook.com/Thin Places. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a quick rating and a review on iTunes and consider subscribing. In our next episode, our guest will be Patricia Byrne, an author from County Mayo, who will talk to us about some special places on Achill Island. So long for now. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to check out our tours to mystical sites at thinplacestour.com. The music for this podcast is Native Spirit, performed by Cheryl Ann Fulton from her collection, The Once and Future Harp. Goodbye for now, wishing you love and light and every blessing.